BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers for making 2018 a success.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming on an early Saturday afternoon to this. I will be talking about cyber norms, which is what everyone loves to talk about, so it'll be exciting. Part of the title of this, I'm sure you've heard in mass media, we see a lot of dropping cyber bombs, this kind of thing that we hear a lot. So kind of taking the inverse of that and talking about norms and how we actually can create some guardrails and some rules of the road for how to behave in cyberspace. And so I'll be walking through both what's going on in the world right now, but also taking a step back and actually walking through some of the methodologies for norm diffusion, which is very much so has roots in social science literature, so we'll get a little bit wonky on the social science side for a little bit, so that all of you, as you leave and go back and hear some of the tech discussions on norms, you'll have that ingrained in some more of a methodological rigor in that area. So first, let's talk about what is appropriate behavior in cyberspace. So right now, as far as the targets, basically anything is fair game. We've seen intellectual property stolen across the board, across the globe. Privacy and civil liberties certainly don't seem to be off limits by the wide range of attackers. Critical infrastructure, we're increasingly hearing about various kinds of malware and APT groups that are in certain kinds of critical infrastructure. We just saw after the hurricane, there was ransomware hitting a town in North Carolina, the water utility. So that's certainly not off limits these days, it seems. And then obviously elections, something that we've been hearing a lot about, and there was just another indictment yet again this past week for interference in the 2018 election. So given this, it's basically the Wild West. We've heard presidents, other kinds of leaders basically use the analogy of cyberspace as the Wild West. And so when it comes to this kind of digital behavior, what are those rules of the road? And for the most part, they just don't exist right now. And so those rules of the road, in more formalized terms, are what norms are. And so the key thing to even just start off on, I think when we hear people talk about norms, there isn't an agreed upon, especially within the security community, what do we even mean by norms? And so linking back to social science, which has followed norms and researched them and reviewed them for decades, norms at the most basic are shared expectations of appropriate behavior. And so they are those guardrails, they are the rules of the road that everyone agrees upon. There can be some that are formal, like in legal aspects, like legislation that gets passed to formalize some of those rules of the road, but there also are a lot that are informal, and so I'll talk about some of those as well. When it comes to cyberspace right now, and again, I know that we generally as a community hate using the word cyber for cyber norms, cyberspace, cyber sovereignty, but at the end of the day, it's what's in doctrine right now in a lot of discussions, and it's what more of the popular audience tends to understand, and so it's a way for us to communicate with a broader community as far as what's at stake here, and so there will be way more cyber used in this talk than normal, so I apologize for that ahead of time. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you guys, I would not recommend doing that as a drinking game for this talk. So we have two competing visions right now. So we talk about nature abhors a vacuum, and so because there's this absence of cyber norms that are out there, there are different visions right now for crafting those. And so on the one hand, we've got cyber sovereignty, which more or less is every state has control over the internet within their borders to various degrees. And then at the other extreme of the spectrum is the multi-stakeholder model, which is much more so in lines of more the utopian vision for how the internet was actually created, for a free and open and secure internet that helps preserve data privacy and security. And one thing to note as I talk about these are two ends of a spectrum, right? And so the realities are always going to be a little bit off, but these are sort of the visions that are really driving various policies that we see going forth right now. And I'll go through each of these in much more detail. But before we do that, I'm going to level the playing field, and we're all going to have an understanding of what norms are. And so part of the reason why we don't have norms right now is because they're actually really extraordinarily hard to do, especially at the global level. And so this is known as the SCurve, and so for how norm diffusion and norm cascading and emergence actually occur. And so for norms to actually occur within an organization, anywhere where there's a group of people, there are going to be some kind of norms that evolve. And so at the global level, you can imagine how hard they are, but first there has to be some sort of norm emergence, then there's going to be some tipping point where they really start to take off, and then they have to be entrenched. And there are challenges at every single one of these steps. It's not just you make it through one step and then it's going to happen. And so each one, especially when it comes to cyber norms, has some very, very distinct challenges. And so looking at an analogy to show first how hard this can be, we look at the seatbelt legislation. And so most people in the United States nowadays do actually use seatbelts. And so when seatbelts were first created, though, almost no one used them. And so in '68, they required lap belts to actually be within the cars, but no one was doing it. And some of the major reasons why people pushed back on it were because of civil liberty infringements and just over-regulation. So they didn't like the government coming in and telling them what they should be doing in their car. However, given that there was that emergence that came from the government as far as requiring the lap belts, that actually led to a bunch of research that came about. And so, about 15 years later, over the course of 15 years, there was a lot of research that went into the value of wearing seatbelts and the lives that can be saved. And so all that research started to permeate as far as the safety benefits of it. And so it started to lead to a cascade. So that research then also forced or encouraged a lot of other states to start doing the seatbelt policies as well. And so between '83 and '89, additional 34 states required mandatory usage. And so by now, something like 87%, roughly depends on your stats, of adults wear seatbelts within the United States, even though for about a third of the states, it's actually only a secondary offense. So it's not really that much of a penalty. And the big reason is that the norms have evolved over time. And I think any of us who have kids now, for them, it's just second nature to be putting a seatbelt on. Whereas even when I was growing up, that was kind of questionable whether we would be wearing them or not. But it's basically it's an informal norm in many ways that it's just something that's done. And so that's how you can think about norms occurring in different areas. There's some very similar, you can think about norms as far as against weapons of mass destruction and against chemical weapons, and those could be whole talks on their own. So let's return back to security. And so norm propagation, starting with norms emergence, the biggest problem we're seeing right now in the cybersecurity area is leadership. And so there is a very big leadership gap as far as shaping the digital norms. And I will walk through the various leaders that are starting to step up to fill in the vacuum. But it's really requires some sort of norm entrepreneurship to actually force these norms to start to elevate and become more of a discussion. We're currently in a place, like I said, between cyber sovereignty visions and multi-stakeholder models, and there just isn't a universally accepted norms. And on the one hand, everyone says, oh, well, it's still early. We really haven't had the internet all that long, but it's been a couple decades, and the impact that we're seeing just keeps to elevate more and more. And more countries are leading to have very the use of the internet has permeated enough states now where there should be some sort of norms. But here's one of the big challenges right here is in the leadership. But even if we did have the leadership at the global level to push forth the appropriate behavior in cyberspace, we have a major collective action problem. And this again, I think we hear about all this, all the various actors that are out there doing nefarious things online. But at the end of the day, it is that does contribute to a lot of the challenges that are out there. So not only do we have roughly 200 nation states, depending on what group is categorizing them, we also have plenty of criminal groups. We've got the mercenaries who may or may not be state affiliated. Corporations are even getting into the game as far as various kinds of behavior online. And in that way, especially the offensive behavior. And then terrorist groups, hacktivists, lone wolves, and I'm sure there's some other major groups out there, but in general, this leads to a major collective action problem to get these various groups together to help formulate what the proper rules of the road are. And so, at the most basic level, if we even could just get the nation states to agree, that would help us go a long way. And then even if we were able to go past the cascade problem and the collective action problem, getting into entrenchment. And so for norms to really become fully entrenched, like we saw with the seatbelt uses, where it just becomes second nature to everyone understands what the proper rules are, the entrenchment really is hard due to compliance. And this is probably something that is not terribly new to anyone here, the challenges with compliance. How do we know that actors are actually even adhering to these norms, right? It's pretty easy to obfuscate their behavior. There's dwell time as far as figuring out how long someone's actually been in the network. So even though an organization may say they're adhering to the norms, maybe they're not, and they just haven't been caught yet. So along with that, with attribution, and then obviously you think about incentives at the nation state level, many states don't want to show their hand, right? And that's actually been one of the discussions we've been seeing a lot this year as far as for the government, is how much should the US government show its hand as far as their offensive capabilities. And on the policy side, there's actually been a lot of interesting back and forth in that area as far as how much do you reveal, how much, because if you can reveal enough, it may help deter. And so that's again is another area of discussion, but at the end of the day, when you have 200 different countries are trying to figure out what to show for their hand and help with deterrence, it makes it incredibly hard for norms to proliferate. And so look at the collapse of global norms, because we've got the cyber sovereignty, we've got the multi-stakeholder model, but there actually have been some efforts to trying to push forth unfortunately, many of those efforts over the last year have basically fallen apart. And so I will talk about some of those, which many of the reasons, as you'll see, are because of the S-curve and just how hard norms are to create. So sort of on the two different ends of the spectrum, from the United States, the Department of State has for quite some time integrated the notion of norms and norms as constructed in a way along the lines of spreading the internet to help promote democracy, to help promote a free and open internet and security along those lines. Given the state of cybersecurity at the State Department, which has been pushed aside a little bit and has been redirected in many areas. There are a lot of people concerned without the State Department guiding cyber norms, who in the US might be. So it was a little bit of a relief, I would say, to see that with a new cyber strategy from about a month and a half ago, it does reiterate the notion of the norms. It sounds using very, very similar language to what we've seen in previous cyber policies. And so that's great to see. So we're seeing it actually out there. And one of the reasons why that matters is because it does signal to the rest of the world that the US still wants to at least try and push forth some leadership in the area of promoting a free and open internet. It is established in their doctrine, so that new policy was great to see. And so again, we see several policies really calling out norms. I mean, if you look at the cyber policy and do just a search for norms, it's mentioned quite a few times. And so that's why, again, why this isn't something that's just, it's not just some theoretical exercise, it's where policies are getting pushed and they're gonna have real world impacts on how we act as a community, but also across the board on civil liberties and conflict and so forth. So on the other end, we've got the International Strategy of Cooperation in Cyberspace, and that's the Chinese version, which in many areas sounds very similar to the US. It has a lot of the similar language used within it, but it really focuses much more so on empowering the state to control the data within their borders. And it's really framed as well in the area of self-defense. That's the reason why, for the cyber sovereignty proponents, they want to protect the data within their countries to help defend against, they could pick the US, pick whatever adversary they may have at the time to defend against them. And so it's framed in a self-defense notion, but at the end of the day, it also has a lot of nationalistic aspects to justify access to data. And so just a few years ago, and it actually kind of seems like a lifetime ago now in international relations, China and the US did sign the SinoAmerican Agreement. And so what prompted this was in 2014, there was an indictment against a handful of PLA members for cyber espionage. And so that then led to a series of processes where the US was talking very publicly about possibly sanctioning China. And to avoid something like that going on, the leaders got together and basically agreed against the use of cyber-enabled espionage for government purposes. And for commercial purposes as well. So, because there also is the perspective of the unlevel playing field by commercial espionage going to the corporations, which in China are very closely state-linked. But at the end of the day, that was the agreement that happened in 2015. And again, you're looking at how the trade wars and so forth are going on now. It's interesting to see this wasn't that long ago, which also should give us hope that perhaps we can return to that at some point. So looking at it through the S-curve of norms, you look at the emergence. So the event that kind of triggered it was the US indictment. And so we can look at that. There could be some disagreement on that, but I think as far as if you were to point to one major trigger for it, I'd say that really helped lead to the process that led to, and the threat of sanctions led to the emergence of this kind of agreement. And so what was interesting, after China and the US formed this agreement, China also then formed very similar agreements with other democratic states. Australia, Canada, for instance, also had very similar agreements signed with China. And so you could start seeing that cascade starting to tip off. Where it got sticky, I think as all of us know where this is going to go, was in the entrenchment area. And so whether or not there was compliance. And so for an update on where that went, at first, we thought there was a desired effect. I think in 2016, I was singing on a talk, I think at Black Hat, where you saw the great graph showing how all the Chinese activity was going down. So everyone pointed to this agreement as, look, China has stopped doing the cyber-enabled commercial IP theft for commercial purposes. And so there, within our community, there was a lot of discussion like, well, it worked. It changed behavior. But then signs started to emerge that maybe that didn't happen. And so if anyone remembers from last year, the CCleaner attack, which ended up targeting a bunch of, a couple hundred different companies with one level and then had an additional payload that targeted just a very select handful of some of the big tech giants. And so that, again, was linked back to China's behavior. And then just earlier this year, I think it's in March of 2018, the US Trade Representative report of Chinese commercial behavior and commercial theft highlighted very much so that China was still continuing with cyber-enabled commercial espionage for commercial purposes. And it was they linked back to Siemen's, Moody's, and a solar power company as far as the continuation of this kind of behavior. And so that really led to the breakage of this kind of agreement. And what's interesting, just yesterday I was reading, there's a new report that came out from Naval War College in conjunction with, I think it's Tel Aviv University, showing that what China had done immediately following after this agreement was actually using different ways to redirect traffic that was coming from the US and redirect it through China first, especially I think it was going to South Korea. They were redirecting that traffic to analyze it. And so what you see with a lot of this when you get to the compliance issue with it, perhaps the tactics at the very tactical level changed. And so the overarching behavior, the strategic behavior didn't change, their tactic did. And so that, so that was one, that was more the bilateral aspect of how norms can go. At more of the global level, the UN group of governmental experts has also been trying to push forth these norms at a global level. And so in 2004, so now we're looking at almost 15 years worth of trying to push forth these kind of agreements. What they really wanted to focus on was those the low-hanging fruit really. What can we use? What's the lowest level that we can use to stop this kind of behavior? And so what they really focus on, they focus on areas that they thought most people or most countries would agree upon. And so it's let's not interfere in emergency response groups, right? Like that seems like a pretty low level. Let's not interfere in critical infrastructure, which turned out to be a harder one. And so they were really looking at some of those that may or may not have been viewed as low-hanging fruit. But unfortunately, by 2017, and even so, they had 5 different group meetings every couple of years on this. By 2017, basically it collapsed. This was last summer that the group of government experts collapsed. And part of the big disagreement was on this right to self-defense. And so you had, which again, the framing of it is what matters a lot, because the right to self-defense seems like you can see the countries arguing on both sides. Those that were arguing for the right to self-defense were trying to protect against the onslaught of attacks that were going on to their companies, whereas many of the people who were, or many of the groups that were doing some of these attacks thought that they were militarizing, that by talking about self-defense, it was a militarization of the internet in a way that they did not want. And so there's a major disagreement that just couldn't come to agreement on there. And there also was a notion of whether the law of armed conflict, which is, it's been around in some ways for almost a millennia, depending on how you look at it. They'd previously agreed upon that the law of armed conflict could just apply then to cyberspace as far as the impact. And you can think about when hospitals are attacked through cyber means and brought down during wartime, which has actually happened. Should that be considered a war crime? And so those are kind of discussions that actually are already going on, across the globe, and we still have no clear understanding of where that line is. And so at the UN, sort of the biggest hope for actually starting to create what's off limits and actually identify some of those things that are off limits for attacking has basically collapsed. And so part of the reason for that disagreement is the collective action and the dueling visions. So I'll go a little bit deeper into what those dueling visions are. So on the one hand, we've got the multi-stakeholder model. And so again, this is the utopian vision, it's aspirational of how to build an open, secure, and resilient internet through that kind of consensus among like-minded states and corporations. And so the key tenets on it, think about internet freedoms, privacy and security, really identifying what is off limits versus what can be done. And then again, it's one of those things, even if, for people who might be a little bit more skeptical that we could actually achieve this kind of global vision, it's one of those things that without sort of that vision to look towards, that vacuum gets filled by pretty much opposing forces that may not have more of that aspirational vision. So having leaders push forth something in the realm of an open, secure internet has huge implications for security and privacy, which is something that really is at the core of what we're doing within this community. And so these kind of discussions are really, really relevant, really impactful. It's something that I wish more in this community would get involved in it. And I think that there are a lot. The challenges that the policymakers don't always engage as well this way. So hopefully down the road we can see a bit more collaboration between the two. So while it is aspirational, there actually are some formal signs that we've seen from the U.S. as far as what is off limits. And so we hear a lot about, and there's been a steady stream of indictments really since 2014. They picked up a lot over the last year or two, and I hear all the time in discussions with folks, like, why are we even doing that? For one, we're never even going to get the perpetrators. They're going to stay in their country, and nothing will ever happen to them. And so sometimes that's true, and honestly, probably a lot of times that's true, but it actually have been a fair amount of arrests as well. And so there are some reasons for that as far as the perpetrators actually can be brought to justice. There are other benefits, though, in addition to that. So I was just in Chile, and the Undersecretary of Department of Defense actually pointed to the U.S. doing indictments and sanctions for justifying why they also made do indictments and sanctions in case they had just had their major bank had been attacked over the summer. And so what happens in the United States, getting back to the leadership issue, by the U.S. having these indictments, by doing sanctions, by doing persona non grata, sort of that series of steps so far that on the one hand are very, very minimal, they're starting to establish what some of those red lines are, so that like-minded countries are more likely going to follow suit to what we're doing. And that's just one of those aspects that happens by naturally being the United States. Yeah, question?
Well, maybe it's a bit of a statement. Even in this country with, where Ted Cruz is running and the voting machines are rigged and they're going from, if you vote straight Democrat, you end up still voting for Cruz. We can't get it right in this country. You're totally right, but we're having problems here with it.
Right, so
I'll let you go.
Yeah, no. So on the one hand, 100%, there are challenges going on in the United States right now, and the point was along those lines that we can't even get our own act together. Many countries can't get their act together right now. So there's a lot of changes going on in the international environment right now. So even with the challenges that we have going on with protecting our own democracy, with being able to protect our own corporations, absolutely we're struggling very much so to try and do those kind of things. But at the end of the day, if we don't do something, not doing anything is not the solution either, right? And so while we could sit back and just kind of let it happen within the United States, that's not going to make anything better. And so again, aspirationally, we need to be doing these things to set that red line so that so that adversaries, attackers start to understand what, one, what's not fair game, what's off limits, and then two, that there will be repercussions for it. And I think this whole, so this slide is actually intentionally full of tons of words, because I think so much we see in the media is that, well, the U.S. is just getting attacked left and right. We see all the different articles that are out there as far as how many millions of dollars, how many corporations, how long the breach time is. That's all we hear about. And basically the overwhelming sentiment is that the government's doing nothing. And so this is just to highlight a little bit. There are some things. And on the one hand, it's a little late. This has been going on for a while. But again, better late than never because of these other externalities that come along with it. By doing the indictments, by doing sanctions, by doing that, especially in response to various aspects. And so it's not just the 2016 elections where we've seen a handful of indictments, sanctions, persona non grata, financial system for the Iranian campaign that was going on, critical infrastructure with NotPetya. And that's an interesting thing. With one of the election indictments, NotPetya was actually hidden within that. At least I thought it was hidden. You had to really read deeply into it. Whereas for us in the community, it's like, oh, that's one of the biggest attacks that we've seen. So it didn't grab the headlines because it's not as sensational as the election interference, but there was some response for that. And the same for, there finally was some response for WannaCry as well. And so these are just some of the different categories that we're starting to see some formal norms. And this stuff takes time. And that's again, look at that S-curve is intentionally there to show just how hard it is. And technology, as we all know, will continue to go expedite and innovate extremely fast. Law and policy does not, as we very much so know. And so these are just a handful I want to show that there are some steps showing as far as that emergence stage, as far as highlighting what is off limits for more of the democratic countries, and looking at how what we do in the U.S. in this area, again, whether or not it has an explicit impact on that specific attacker, may not necessarily be the goal. When you look at the higher level, what signals it sends, what's the broader strategy, and how do other countries perceive that? So on the other end is cyber sovereignty. And so this is the complete government control of the internet within their borders. It's really looking at control of economic data, social data, political data, and so forth. And again, a lot of the language around it, though, sounds very, very similar to what we hear from the multi-stakeholder model, which for a different talk, we could talk about some of the disinformation and so forth that could go along with that. But at the end of the day, it's under the auspices of sovereignty and not allowing others to intervene in your own country. But really, what it is it's an argument and justification for a greater state surveillance, greater access to all data of people within their country, doing things like astroturfing as a way of just flooding the social media with data, so that which turns out to be a form of censorship because people can't find the other kinds of data besides what the propaganda thrown at it. And then it gets into various kinds of spyware and so forth used by governments as well. It helps justify all those kinds of behaviors that we see. And just to highlight just how much it sounds similar to the multi-stakeholder model when we hear leaders talking at global forums. And this again, looking at leaders actually going out there and the importance of leadership. Xi Jinping, he talked here, but he also just a few years ago talked at Davos for one of the first times at the World Economic Forum, and gave a speech that sounded very much so like parts of it could have come out of previous American administrations. And so there is a bit of the using the same language for very different purposes that we need to be aware of here. But at the same time, because it does sounds like a good notion, not allowing other countries to interfere. But again, you have to think about the governments behind it and what their incentives are and what their motivations are. And that's again very similar to what we think about in our community as far as attribution and why a corporation, government, whomever may be attacked. You have to look at the motivation and incentives of various attackers or of whoever's doing the activity. And so I think I alluded to earlier on, those are the two extremes. The reality is always going to be somewhere muddled and somewhere in between. So looking at the multi-stakeholder model, I showed some examples of what the US is doing. But there's also the GDPR, which is Europe's new data protection. I've heard, that corporations find it very tedious, it's hard. Some are embracing it, some are not. So that's again could be something we discuss after. But then today with the GDPR, one of the key intents was to empower individuals to have control over their data. And so while it's not perfect, and I'm sure it will evolve over time, it's probably one of the first major agreements that we've seen globally to help put the power back into individuals' hands for control over their data. And so again, absent something like that going on, we're going to see the other models take to diffuse more and more. NATO's Article 5 has an attack on, so it's the collective security component of NATO. So an attack on one is an attack on all. They've now added the cyber component onto it. Part of the challenge with that is that basically that's all that's been done. There hasn't been greater definition as far as what actually is an attack. So you can imagine a lot of that stemmed from the various attacks and interference that went on within Estonia, Georgia, and are continuing to go on across the entire former Soviet Union. And so some of those, even those aren't 100% under the multi-stakeholder model, but they're sort of the best versions of what we're seeing right now going on in that area. Looking at more of the limit intervention and some pushback that's going on, I think the UK Investigatory Powers Act is probably the one that we see most in the news. I think people talk about it also as a surveillance act. But the interesting thing with that is after it came into play, it was basically giving the government was giving greater access to data. There was a lot of pushback within the UK on that, so that they're actually being forced to update and evolve the policy to still take some baby steps to start protecting people more so, individual data more so. And so that's where a lot of these come into play, is that it's important to have the aspirational version so that when some of these other policies pop up, you can point to those and also say, well, this is where we need to be going. We understand the government has the security needs, but individuals have their individual rights to protect as well. US Rule 41 as well is the one where the FBI could get access to data outside their jurisdiction by remote access. So that again is one there's been a lot of pushback. There's again within the United States, so none of these are agreed, none of these are finalized, right? As far as the conversation's over. And so while they've been passed, there's still plenty of agreement that's really trying to push that and it's one of the things we're trying to appease the different interest groups that are going on, and so something just to keep an eye on. And the other one, from within the more of the group of democracies, so Australia has now recently proposed a legislation allowing, basically requiring some sort of backdoor. And so basically enabling some sort of encryption to be, providing a means for government to access even with an encrypted software. And so on the one hand, so that actually stemmed from the Five Eyes, which are the group of like-minded states, New Zealand, Australia, UK, US, Canada, and all those groups agreed to this kind of policy. So seeing Australia as a first mover in this is something that we should actually also keep an eye on, because we still have the encryption battles are not over. As much as we'd like to think that they are, they're not going away anytime soon. And then finally, on the other end, we've got the cyber sovereignty, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is it's another political and economic global group of states. Very much so has pushed forth the proper behavior and their guidelines for how to behave. But then you've got the aspects like the Great Firewall. Iranian has a national intranet. And it's the various means of data censorship and manipulation we're seeing across the globe. Censorship has been on the rise for, I think, at least the last 6 years across the globe, and all of that gets linked back to these broader policies. And so given that we have all these different countries doing all these different policies, whereas the internet emerged first as that this global, one global internet, one World Wide Web, the reality that we're moving more and more towards and have to start being more prepared for is this notion of data localization. And so it's also considered splinternet, balkanization, however you want to talk about it, as far as more government policies breaking up and having different requirements for how data is stored and is accessed. And so currently we have over about 100 different countries have some form of data localization. And so again, depending on it's where how you actually think about it depends on where you're actually sitting. And so for the countries that are enacting a lot of this data localization, their argument is that we're protecting data. And whether they're protecting data for the individuals or for government access or things to keep in mind, questions to always be asking. So at least 100 of them have either proposed or have enacted some of these legislations. Vietnam has one that very much sounds like it's copying the China playbook in many ways. And so requiring tech companies to store data on Vietnamese citizens in country. And so again, the justification for that is that we've seen the breaches that go on here. It's either a lack of faith in the companies to store and protect the data elsewhere, but also it's also under the auspices of having government have access to that data as well when they want to. India similarly has passed legislation requiring local storage of data on transactional data. As you can start thinking about how hard that's going to be to actually keep track of all of that. And then the USMCA, which formerly known as NAFTA, actually has, it's US, Mexico, Canadian new free trade agreement. There's a chapter on that on e-commerce that for people who actually who are interested in this area may want to take a look at, because within however you want to pronounce this horrible new acronym, within it there's a chapter on how to craft policy safeguards. And so there are some implications in there and some concerns that the way that they've crafted it is going to make it much harder for those in the US, especially or Mexico or Canada, to provide additional privacy safeguards on data. And so we need to keep an eye on that and see where that may evolve into, but that's just, again, it's one of those things where all this kind of different legislation and proposals aren't just in security legislation, they're also in trade legislation, other areas where data access and data protection is a high priority. And this, again, is just one graph of it. And again, why I like showing this, it's super non-intuitive for how we would think about it as far as data protection or data localization. And so it's all where you stand on it. It depends on where you sit. Do we want data protection laws? In certain countries, even if they're very similar, at the end of the day, the impact may be very, very different based upon what government is in charge. And so a lot of it goes back to very similar fundamentals of democracies versus authoritarian, what government access is, and the ongoing battles between individual control of data versus government access to it. But this is just one site that shows the variation that's starting to go on. And obviously they didn't even analyze the entire globe, but those are just some of them. And so what's interesting that's also going on is, as the countries are kind of flailing around a bit, trying to figure out their own path for helping shape what the appropriate behavior in cyberspace is, corporations, who are the ones, in many cases, under attack a lot, are starting to take over as far as providing their own means to shape the norms. And so just a few years ago, Jeff Moss talked about norms. Again, this is one of those things where you think about norms may not necessarily have a place within more on the tech side, but it does, because it all becomes very, very integrated as far as linking back to security and privacy. But what always kind of makes me laugh about this is that it can just be a norm. It's very easy to do, and it's not. It's very, 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 very difficult. It'd be great if we could just say let's the easy button and make these norms for what's off limits occur, but it's not. It's easier said than done. So these are three of the major efforts that are going on right now. There are some other ones, like the Carnegie Endowment has created a group of norms for the financial industry. But these three that I want to talk about just really briefly, there's the tech accord. I don't know if anyone has been following that at all. So I think RSA perhaps in 2016 is when Brad Smith from Microsoft first talked about a Geneva Convention for cybersecurity. That has, over time, has evolved into going into the, into a broader group where something like 60 global companies now, I think initially, even just in April when this was actually released, was maybe 30-ish companies. So it's now doubled. And there's some of the major companies that are out there. And basically what they're doing is they're identifying the rules of engagement. They're identifying that whether or not they'll give access to governments, whichever government. And so they're looking at it very much so as all countries are created equal. And so because these are global corporations that are working across the globe. And so they're not going to allow access to certain kinds of data. They're agreeing not to act on the offense on behalf of anyone. And so there's a list out there of sort of like the thou shalt not within this tech accord. And so that's probably the most prominent one that's out there. About a month or two after the tech accord was released, the Charter of Trust was put out by Siemens. And so if you remember, I talked back earlier about Siemens was one of the groups that was under attack a lot and was written in the US trade rep document for the breach that's been linked back to China. And so Siemens now has brought together about 8 additional members, and what they're focused on is a little bit different from the tech accord. They're really focusing on security throughout the supply chain and providing sort of the framework for all companies that are part of this agreement must all adhere to these various levels of cybersecurity. And so if you think about the tech accord is more along the lines of what the rules of engagement are and how they're going to interact with governments and how they're protecting the data. Charter of Trust is a little bit more of a cyber hygiene, which is again one of the awful terms that's out there, but it's more along those lines, and especially it approaches the supply chain issue as well, which we don't see as much elsewhere. And then finally, there's the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. And so this is an interesting one, and Jeff Moss is part of this one. So it's got people from the tech community. It's got Joseph Nye, who's one of the major international relations scholars on norms. It also has some government people, and it has representatives from all the major regions. It's not Western dominant. It's really getting a global perspective as far as all the commissioners that are on it. And what they're doing is they're gathering. It's almost like they're trying to recreate what the UN couldn't do by bringing in all the different groups and all the different interests together and provide those recommendations over the next few years. And so that's one that I think I'll be interested to see what they come up with. Again, they're interesting as far as they're more of a fusion of both government and private sector. And if anyone was following, Tim Cook was in the news a fair amount this week for some discussions on privacy. And so we're getting how corporations are starting to step up and be much more vocal in this area for setting the rules of the road for what should be done and what should not be done. And so in his presentation in Brussels just earlier this week, the right to have personal data minimized, rights to knowledge, right to access, and right to security. And these are some of the fundamentals that are core to the debate that's going on between the two different stakeholders.
You get to know what data is being collected on you, what's happening with it, and how it's stored and all that.
Yeah, where it is.
As a person whose data is being collected.
Right. So you think about like the GDPR has the requirement that someone can ping whatever company and they get their data back from them. And that's what, or the right to be forgotten is also part of the GDPR. So it's it's a big, more so an umbrella term for those various kinds of aspects for, again, individual data, understanding of who's taking what and who has it. And so sort of the current state of where things are going, given all these sort of cross-cutting issues, all the different actors that are going on, really highlight that the way norms occur, again, stepping back to more of the formal frameworks and so forth, there are traditional forums, the IGOs, the International Government Organizations. We've seen that with the UN, we've seen that with Shanghai Cooperation Organization, EU, and so forth. The bilateral agreements, we saw that with the SinoAmerican Agreement. The non-governmental organizations and advocacy groups. And there are a lot of those are the groups that are really going to be, forcing and encouraging a lot of these other actors to push forth certain, to advocate in many cases for the security and privacy. But I think the addition, what's different about now versus how norms used to occur, is really the role of the tech titans as well. So the really big corporations, and that's why I want to talk through some of the efforts that the corporations are doing right now. They're having a much oversized play compared to how we used to see global norms crafted and shaped. And so I absolutely would keep an eye on what they're doing, which also links back to, and we've seen all the big tech companies brought to the hill, and so far haven't seen much go on. But it may very well be just a matter of time before we see more pressure on those areas. We're also seeing sort of that it's sort of the cross-pollination going across different industries. I talked about it a little bit with the new NAFTA, as far as having other areas, like commercial areas, tying in the privacy and security into it. So the UN Treaty on Human Rights is actually starting to look at creating binding ways or binding rules for how corporations behave, which I think is really, really interesting. It isn't something that has been discussed a ton. And so it's not scheduled for release until next year. What they want to do is look at, traditionally the UN Treaty on Human Rights as it pertains to corporations is going to look at workplace violence and conditions along those lines. They're starting to look at how, should there be something along the lines of how corporations are protecting the data and privacy of individuals. And so where that, it's one of those things that's under debate right now. There's the legislation, there are draft legislation, so you can certainly find those online. And what then, in turn, for all this stuff, the compliance issue is that will corporations be held liable for, if they fail to adhere to those, to the rules of the road that are crafted. And so, again, it's something that to keep an eye on for next year. If you're interested in this area, I'd recommend taking a look at what's drafted so far. But it's one of those things where you don't necessarily look at Treaty on Human Rights as something that might then have repercussions within the security community. And we're really starting to see just the cross-pollination across different areas, because as we all know, security does absolutely permeate all aspects of life. And so one of the reasons within the US is you're talking about potential shifts going on in the legislation is because there's more and more support. So I was talking about the NGOs and some of those groups. Within the US, there is more and more support for some sort of regulation going on tech in the realms of preserving privacy and security and data protections. And so this is actually, we don't normally ever see shifts this big on a topic over such a short period of time. And so again, that's just something that I would keep an eye on where public opinion is, because if in the public, if no one, if we give up and just basically assume that all of our data is out there everywhere, there'll be nothing will change. And so again, something to push forth and really help encourage and make sure that's done the right way, which is the other thing. As we all know, regulations could also go badly. So looking ahead, I'm going to leave a few minutes for Q&A if we have any. So it is hard. We have all these different interests going on. It's extraordinarily difficult to actually to get to the entrenchment, and there isn't really that common consensus on what should where are the boundaries for offense, where are the boundaries for privacy, who's responsible, all those kind of things. So if it's so hard, why does it matter? And so I think that we're very much so at an inflection point between these two. And again, it's not going to look at specifically like one of these. There'll be some variation of it depending on what model prevails. But the cyber sovereignty model for sure is starting to permeate much more so over the last few years. And it's not all aspects of it, but they're different aspects of it. If you think of like Brazil blocking WhatsApp for a little while, we see some of the issues going on in Turkey. You see Vietnam's new policy. And so even in some areas, actually you even look at some of the Mexican spyware that was found, I think about 2 years ago, and then some of the challenges that we have in the United States in this area. So it is an aspect where various variations of the cyber sovereignty framework are starting to permeate faster in some ways than the multi-stakeholder model. And I think for me that's very troubling. And so it's nice to see there are still continuing efforts that are going on, and I absolutely keep an eye on watching those. But at the end of the day, how these cyber norms start to evolve and how they permeate and what they actually look like has enormous implications, not just for democracy, but I'd say it does, especially if we look at, in 2016 alone had at least 18 elections were interfered in across the globe. So it's not just a US issue. Has major repercussions for conflict and stability. If you look at some of the roles of, even just in social media, like in Myanmar, leading to helping instigate some of the genocide that's going on there, it has huge repercussions in those areas as far as what's appropriate for data, what are the role of the tech giants in controlling and censoring, which again, if you don't get it right, you can still over course correct to greater censorship. Major aspects of national security, I think that's sort of a no-brainer here. But economic security as well, especially when you think about financial systems and what is on, what's within the bounds of attacks. Then getting in more to the privacy space, data protection. How we even look at data protection could very well be shaped by these norms. Is data protection by the government, or is it data protection for individuals? And that's how it links back to the privacy notion at the end of the day. And so, cyber norms as a whole is a really large umbrella term for so many different aspects, but they are very much so interconnected, and they have impacts, I'd argue, across the road here. And so I will leave it at that and leave a few minutes for questions. But thanks so much for everyone for staying and for your time. Question up front.
Okay, so I have two, and you can pick which one you want to
All right. So the first question is on how do we convince, how do we sort of get over the belief that our privacy is dead, and sort of like long-lived privacy, there's nothing we can do about it. And so on the one hand, I think that there is a big core group that think that way, and perhaps they're more vocal. I think there are still enough people that really aren't satisfied with just sitting back and accepting that. And that's, I would just argue, we just can't accept that. Like, what world do we want to live in? And we, as a community, I think, can very much so help shape that world that we want to live in through the skill sets that are here, as far as helping preserve, for data protection, for helping protect corporations from having their, IPs, their IP stolen and so forth. And so, I think the more we can actually talk about, here's really legitimately like what's online right now, or what's at stake. Hopefully that can, I just say engagement. I mean, that's how a lot of these things can change. Engage in these discussions as opposed to it just being black and white. And there are going to be some aspects of privacy that are going to be handed over, but there are also some aspects that we can regain and should continue to try and save. As far as the security, privacy, convenience, unholy trinity, which is basically you can't have all three at once. Again, I would sort of push back that why not? I think security has been behind other industries as far as usability, and there is sort of a push towards more usable security. And so if we can make security more accessible to a broader group of people instead of just creating tools for ourselves, I think that's a good way to start looking at the security, convenience, and privacy. That's more at the individual level. At a higher level, you think about the government, the Silicon Valley, DC tech divide between national security and privacy. And surveillance, yeah. No, exactly. And even with that, I think the UK Investigatory Powers Act is a good example of where the population saw their government as overreaching. And so through public responses and public feedback, they're starting to push back and starting to retract on some of those policies and make them more in tune with protecting individual privacy, which gets back to, again, the engagement aspect. So it's just not accepting. And so but it's hard. And that's, at the end of the day, having all three is going to be very hard, which is why I don't think we're there yet. But again, it's something that we should not, again, just assume that can't be done. All right, I think that's it. All right, well, thanks, everyone.